We are live.
Sage, you're muted.
I think I'd learned. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chair Sage Turner, and I'd like to welcome you to the March 29, 2023 Housing and Community Development Committee meeting. All council members and staff are participating virtually today. For those of you out there with us, welcome. To help you follow along, I'll be stating each section of the agenda as we proceed. We're going to be streaming live on our virtual engagement hub that you can find on the front page of the city's website. We also have an option for you to call in and listen live. So to do that, you will call this number, 855-925-2801. That's 855-925-2801. When prompted, the meeting code is 9791. If you wish to get in the caller queue, you will be muted and hear the meeting live. And you'll hear speakers. And when you're ready to speak, your name is called, you push star 3. You push star 3 to enter the speaker queue. All right, so I'm going to go through roll call. If you can, when I say your name, please come off mute and say a quick hello. Councilwoman Antoinette Mosley.
Hello.
Councilwoman Shanika Smith.
Hello.
Assistant City Manager Rachel Wood.
Good afternoon.
Community Economic Development Director Nikki Reed.
Hello, everyone.
Affordable Housing Officer Sasha Vertinsky.
Good afternoon.
Great. Oh, do we have Janice Ashley with us? I just saw her on the list too. I didn't think so. Okay. All right, we're going to move right into the agenda. And first up, we have a approving the minutes from our last meeting. Where did I just lose my agenda? Oops. It sounded like Councilwoman Mosley had read them. Did you have any comments, questions?
No, I move that we accept the minutes.
Great. Can I get a thank you? And we got to do a roll call vote because we're still virtual. Councilwoman Mosley?
Rachel's hand is up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Point of clarification, we're actually asking for adoption of the previous 2 meetings, so February 8th as well as March 21st.
Thank you. I was racing to get my agenda open. I had lost it, and I do see it's February 8th and March 21st. So I think that was the motion you meant, was it?
Yes, I move that we accept the meetings for the February 8th,
Thank you.
March 21st, 2003 HCD.
Thank you. And Shanika, did you second that?
I did.
Great. So let's try that roll call vote again. Councilwoman Mosley.
Aye.
Councilwoman Smith.
Aye.
Myself, aye. Thank you, Rachel. All right, that concludes item number 1 on the agenda. For those of you listening in, we're going to move on to item number 2, which is a Housing Trust Fund application overview. If you're looking for documents related to this meeting, you can go to the city's website and look for HCD committee, and you'll see today's documents. And I'm going to pass it to Sasha Vertinsky.
You're on mute, Sasha.
Sorry. Thank you, Chair Turner. This is a very brief overview of what we'll be looking at next week at your special meeting. Next, and so I'm just going to go over a little bit about the Housing Trust Fund. I know you all you're in home world right now, but so Housing Trust Fund's coming up. So just a few key takeaways here. As you remember, City Council approved revisions to the policy in December. And we have aligned our application process with Buncombe County to assist in decision making and provide some predictability. 6 applications were received for this round, and we'll be bringing 5 of them forward. 1 application was deemed ineligible because of, I can go into that if you want, but just some conflicts with fair housing law around target population. So the total funding request for the 5 eligible applications is $5.2 million, and funding recommendations will be made in April, and then City Council will have final consideration on April 25th. Next. This is just some quick background. For the past five or more years, the city has been allocating approximately $500,000 every year through the budget process to the Housing Trust Fund. $5 million of the bond funds in 2017 were allocated to the Housing Trust Fund, And last fall, you all allocated the remaining $6 million to the Housing Trust Fund. So the current balance available is approximately 7.65 million. And just some history over the last 18 years up to 2019, the Housing Trust Fund loaned approximately 15 million and produced 1,300 affordable units. Next. So here is just a summary table of the 5 applications we'll be bringing forward to you all. The first 3, Redwood Commons, Fairhaven Summit, and Reimagining D Review, are all low-income housing tax credit projects. They're all 9% tax credit projects. And so they're all 100% affordable projects as well. All 3 of these were conditional zoning projects that City Council approved in 2022, either May or June for these projects. And these are their asks. And then the second 2 projects are cottage projects. Stewart Street Cottages is 10 units of home ownership. So that's 100% affordable for all the units that are being built. And then Oak Hill Cottages are being proposed. It's a mix of rental and home ownership. And it says 20 affordable units, and that's affordable as defined as 80% and below. There is an additional 8 units for home ownership that are up to 100% AMI, which our Housing Trust Fund policy allows. But I guess technically we usually use 80% as the affordable definition. Next. So here's our schedule. And here's the schedule we've been following. So next week we'll review applications and hear from applicants. Staff will do a very brief kind of introduction of each project and then let the applicant speak. And, we've discussed, possible council having a time to ask questions either in the meeting or after. At the next meeting, April 18th, we'll bring forward our full staff recommendations, and you'll hopefully feel comfortable to vote on applications and what you'd recommend to City Council. And then April 25th, we'd be at City Council. Next. Just for your information, this is the schedule that Buncombe County is following. Their meetings are on the very similar track as yours. So they're kind of by April 25th, they will be wrapped up. And how theirs works, just as a reminder, it says here, their committee makes a kind of final recommendation at the end of the month of April, and it moves on to the county commission as a part of their budget process. But usually what their committee recommends tends to be what the commission adopts. Next. And this is just a little bit more detail about the next 2 meetings. I've kind of already covered that. On April 18th, you'll have a little bit more information and analysis. And yes, next. And these are just our key takeaways once again. Are there any questions about that process?
I appreciate the summary. This is our first attempt of trying to align with Buncombe County's schedule. How do you think it's going on the staff end and meetings and such?
I think it's gone well. We met pretty frequently in January, February. We haven't met with them recently, but their committee is meeting. I thought they were meeting April 4th. They're actually meeting at sometimes the exact same time you all are meeting. So it's April 4th. And I believe in the 25th, I don't know if there may be another meeting in there as well, but
it's really helpful to the projects. But as far as, on our end, it was okay. It wasn't too much of a workload to change the whole schedule, and we were able to move through it okay. That's great.
And I should have said those 3 tax credit projects are all also asking for county funding. The Fairhaven Meadows.
Are they 4s or 9s?
I'm sorry?
4s or 9s?
They're all 9%.
That's what I thought.
Fairhaven Meadows got $1 million in the last round from Buncombe County, but they're asking for an additional $540,000.
So how over in Homeworld, I guess I I guess this becomes a calendar item. Like over in Homeworld, what we do and what we did this morning was allocate towards projects. And then the ones that are not awarded, we do the allocation to help their application. And then the ones that are actually awarded the tax credits, we all come back together, peel back the money and reallocate. But in this case, is a housing trust fund loan, and we can't do that. So what happens if what's the timeline? If we give to an HTF to a tax credit project, does it have like 2 years to use it, or is it just unidentified timeline?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure, honestly.
We might need to look at that, right?
I mean, they all have gotten their tax credits, so they're not on the last year, when folks were asking for, like, deed review came to city council in May, if you'll remember.
They were awarded,
Funding,
right?
they were on track to apply. The tax credit deadline is usually like the second week of May. So some of the projects the county has, those folks are trying to get those funding commitments before they apply. But
Right.
All three of these have applied and have been awarded tax credits. So
I wonder, as we look at this policy, if that's something we should layer in or look at. You know, it's one thing to say, you know, we want all the projects. Some of them just take several years to get awarded. So do we want to tie the money up in that hope, or I guess it has to be tied to their application over and over. So yeah.
there may be something in there that I'm just not recalling.
Okay. Me too. Okay. Any other questions from the committee on this? Okay. I appreciate that. Very informative and good reminder with all these housing meetings, what's happening and how much. All right. That is good for item number 2 on our agenda. We're going to move on to item number 3, which is the CDBG funding recommendations. And we're going to have an application review, presentations. We did all that. So we have some staff funding. And I think, Nikki, you're going to talk about funding recommendations?
Correct. I will
That
walk
looks
us through
good.
the slides.
That's the wrong presentation. Maybe that's the next one.
Yep, Katie's bringing up the right one now. And for the committee, I do want to recognize we are joined today by our staff who form the Community Development Division. And so I'll recognize Thana Alley, Laura Neer, Christina Harris, Miranda Masters, and Megan Gaskell. They make up our Community Development Division. I'm so thrilled to have the opportunity to work closely with them through this process and present really the culmination of a lot of several weeks worth of work, starting with the application process back in December. I also want to acknowledge that Nicole George has joined us as well. Nicole George is a project manager in our building construction division of our capital projects department. She's currently managing the Stevens Lee project. And so she's here also to talk about some funding potential for community centers, or at least to be on hand to answer some questions. Nicole, we'll try not to put you on the spot, but just want to welcome everyone to the meeting.
Oh, women.
Okay. Yeah, right.
Thank
So let's
you.
get started. Katie, if you'll advance the slide. So we are here to talk about our funding recommendations for Community Development Block Grant. So really, this program is designed to help develop viable communities by providing housing, suitable living environments, and opportunities for economic growth for people of low and moderate income. So you'll see that comes directly from HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, through which this program cycles through. So this year we had 14 applications for our CDBG funding. That total amount of funding availability is a little over 1.1. 8 of those were for the public service categories, and our funding availability there is 166,000 and some change. 6 total were for the non-public service component of the CDBG funds, and that availability is a little over 700,000. And then 20% of those community development funds are used for administration, so for staff and for the administration of the programs once we go to contract. And so this staff team evaluated those applications to determine eligibility with CDBG. 3 of those applications were deemed ineligible. When that happens, we really want to support these agencies by referring them to other available funding sources that we have, or offer technical assistance. We also talk amongst ourselves in terms of how we can improve our process for the next funding cycle and really improve technical assistance in advance of the applications as well. So we are here today to seek action from this committee to really bring forward these recommendations to City Council for approval of our annual action plan. And I'll talk about that timeline next. So why don't we go to the next slide, Katie? So as you can see here, this really just walks us through where we have been. In December, we opened up the application for both the CDBG and home programs. The applications were due early February. Then staff performs that review February, March. You all heard the applications from the applicants and earlier, I think last week it was. And then here we are today to look at funding recommendations. At the conclusion of our meeting, then staff will take the funding recommendations and it will go through a public comment period. That public comment period will last through May, and then ultimately council will hold up a public hearing and have these recommendations be heard at full council in that May timeframe to complete our process here. Next slide. Okay, so I wanted to walk everyone through our funding amounts so that we're clear on what we have to allocate. So that, I'm sorry, I see a typo right there. That should be FY 23-24 allocation. It's just over $1 million. We also look at our program income every year and estimate that at $72,000, which brings us to our total. And so then when we take the appropriate amounts given for the public services component of the program, that's capped at 15%. That gives us $166,000 and some change. Our planning admin cap at 20%, so we take the full amount there at $221,363. That gives us about $719,432 of non-public service dollars to award, and so we see that balances. Next slide. Okay, so just walking us through our eligible applications. As you can see, you heard from these groups at our last meeting: the Spark Foundation, Helpmate, Haywood Street Congregation, Pisgah Legal Services, On Track Financial, Homeward Bound. So these groups all had applications that were for the purposes of our public service category. As you can see, it's a quite competitive fund here with a total request of $243,900, really for that limited balance. So let's do the next slide and we'll look at the overview of the eligible applications for non-public services. So again, last week we heard from Mountain Biz, Helpmate, Carolina Small Business Development Fund, Homeward Bound, Asheville Area Habitat. They all submitted eligible applications for the non-public services. And you can see here that the total amount submitted for that category was underneath what we actually have available in our balance. So the total there was $565,150, and you'll see the balance there of $719. All right, next slide. Okay, so always wanted to ensure that we look back at our consolidated plan. So our consolidated plan is a plan that we pursue on a periodic basis to really develop priorities for the federal funds that we receive. And so this table comes directly from that consolidated plan. Heads up, that plan went from 2020 to 2024. So in the next little bit, we will be embarking upon the public engagement process to really develop the new plan for the next block of time. So I just wanted to always call that into mind as we look at these funding decisions. And you'll see that we have a priority of these needs, and then from there we also develop different levels of priority to correspond there. So I wanted to ground us with that. Next slide. Okay, so as we look at funding, something that we always consider is really being in compliance with HUD regs. Of course, we want to be good stewards of these funds and ensure the proper expenditure in our community to really support those that we intend to serve. And so really being timely with our funds is a huge priority for us to ensure that we can meet that timeliness test or ensure fidelity with our HUD partners. When we look at these recommendations, we really look for applicants to demonstrate that CDBG eligibility, demonstrate that organizational capacity. Federal funds are not for the faint of heart, so really ensuring that there is adequate capacity to see those funds ultimately cycle through. And then looking at the use of funds and the historical performance of the applicants. We also, of course, need to maintain our ability to administer these funds, so managing the projects and managing and being having good customer service on our end means being staffed up. And so ensuring that we have that planning and administration funds is necessary. And then, as you can see, we want to look at how to really ensure that we're fully spending the allocation, right? And so when we looked at that amount of eligible applications that we received for the non-public service dollars, in a previous year, we looked at funding the Stevens Lee Community Center, and community center improvements are a listed use of priority need in our consolidated plan. So we're wanting to really continue the conversation here today about allocating those remaining non-public service dollars after the competitive process concludes to our community centers. So we'll talk more. Next slide. Okay, so let's start looking at these funding tables and really talking through exactly what we're hoping to accomplish here. So of the eligible applications, we are now proposing the recommended awards that you see here on the screen. One thing that made sense as we were looking to how to balance the level of requests with the availability of funding is to really look at what happened last year and try to understand how that would be carried forward into this year's funding request. As you can see, we wanted to populate that third or the last column there with their prior year award, and really using that as a starting point. I think, as we know with nonprofit management, having that consistency is a good basis for how we can also make decisions to allow the nonprofits to continue their programs and do the good work that they do. So as you can see, our awards are based on a carry forward plus, really looking at how we can provide additional funding to those agencies that we funded. And so we're not able to really meet the full funding for the Spark Foundation or for Helpmate, but we're seeing how we're carrying forward what they've been allocated from last year and really hoping to bump that up a little bit. As you can see, Haywood Street Congregation, so really one of the only public service applicants that do the type of work that they do. They did not ask for funding last year, but this year we're hoping to offer them full funding, given that there's a limited availability of service in that respite program for people experiencing homelessness. Pisgah Legal, you can see there that we're carrying forward what they were funded last year, plus a little bit more. On Track Financial, looking to fully fund their request because it was very close to what they had last year. And then Homeward Bound's Coordinated Entry Program, again, looking at what they had last year and carrying that forward. So that gets us to our full expenditure of public services. And Katie, we'll advance the slide and we'll look at the next. Okay, so a little bit about our non-public service recommendations. Again, when we have the ability to fund these programs in our existing allocation, that works well, right? That seems to make a lot of sense with how we can allocate these funds. We also wanted to ensure to populate what these agencies were funded last year and feel confident that that is helpful in our consideration here today. So again, we're offering the fully funding the applicant recommendation, the applicant request for Mountain Biz, Helpmate, Carolina Small Business Development Fund, Homeward Bound, and Asheville Habitat. And then here's where we want to acknowledge the community center contingency. So we've had conversations with capital projects and with our Parks and Recreation team. And as you all know, you've seen some traffic actually at City Council around the Stevens Lee improvements. I think there were some items on last night's agenda actually about carrying forward with the work there. I know that according to Nicole, the bids that they've received for the initial construction are much higher than what we allocated last year. And I did note that. I apologize, it's not included on this table. But last year we allocated about $784,000 to Stevens Lee. But the bids I know were well above that. And so whether we're able to use these funds for Stevens Lee, or if we are able to program the community center funding to other eligible community centers, it seems that we're kind of centering around a best practice, at least, really allow this competitive process to proceed. And then once we determine our recommended award out of that pot, to really look at how we can cycle these funds to best use for our community centers. It meets an area need, and it does serve people of low mod income. We're only really able to spend these monies on community centers that are located in the appropriate census tracts that fit that HUD definition. But with that, we are proposing that we earmark $154,281 to community centers, and we are currently working with capital projects and parks on whether that actually can be allocated to Stevens-Lee, given where they are with their current process, to really see that, when we're working with that facility, making the improvements, that we really do our best to do as much as we can while we have focus on that property. So that really rounds out our recommendations for the non-public services. And Katie, if you'll advance the slide, we're back to our key takeaways slide. So I'm happy to answer questions. We can walk back through any of the other tables, but otherwise we are seeking HCD's action today, which will help set us up for our public comment period for the action plan.
Thank you, Nikki. I have a technical question, a little in the weeds. So the process for this, it's always reviewed, it's HUD money. If we have the surplus in non-public services, are we able to allocate some of it to applicants for more than they applied? I'm looking specifically at Homeward Bound. And when we look at the public services, we're not able to fund everybody fully. There's $12,100 left that they requested. And we're looking at this organization for so much right now in our community. I'm trying to find a way to fully fund them. But can we use some of that surplus from non-public services and give them more than their ask in that case? And would they be allowed to use it to help complete their other ask, or is that really not allowed because it's so technical and reviewed in HUD and so on?
So, and I will ask Megan to come off mic if I go sideways, but from my understanding, that public services cap of 15% is exactly that. So we are only able to take 15% of the total allocation to earmark for public services. So the answer is no.
Let me see.
Cannot.
Let me be more clear. If we gave them more in their non-public service ask, they will only be able to spend it and be reviewed for spending and so on for case management, not for coordinated entry.
That is my understanding, yes. That we can't mix those funds up.
Company and do different things, but it has to be just for that was applied and held to. Okay. I love this. It's great. I always love it when we have extra money. The idea of committing more to Stevens-Lee when they're facing some increased costs sounds good. My concern is not being able to fully fund Homeward Bound at a time we're really needing their services. Any others have some comments or questions? Want to talk about any of the fundings?
I don't. I'm quite happy with the suggested funding amounts, frankly.
Okay. I appreciated how you compared it to what they got the year before, so they at least had that in case they were depending on it. And you were able to tick it up in some cases. Councilwoman Smith, any concern from you?
No, this may be the easiest CDBG funding decision I've ever made in the history of being on council.
I agree.
I'm satisfied.
Okay. It's kind of crazy, isn't it? Yeah, my only concern is at Homeward Bound, just because they're doing so much, but I don't have a suggestion of where to pull it from. So I really can't satiate my own concern. But I'll at least voice that because I know we are in such need of their services. But gosh, guys, it sounds like this is a really simple one. Staff, you did a great job. Kudos. We normally have, moving things around on the fly and having well-vetted discussions on this. But I think all of these groups are well known. They have historic funding. We've got a couple new ones in there, and that's wonderful. And we're
Are
able
you
to.
ready for a motion?
Yeah, go for it.
I move to recommend the FY 23-2024 CDBG funding allocations to City Council for submission of the fiscal year 23-24 annual action plan for HUD approval, authorizing the city manager to sign all necessary documents to this effect.
Do we have a second? Great. How about a roll call vote? Councilwoman Mosley.
Aye.
Councilwoman Smith.
Aye.
Myself, aye. Great. Well, that's just wonderful. So those funding recommendations will move forward to council, and we have completed item number 3 on our agenda. Those of you listening in, we're moving on to item number 4. So we have Laura, who's going to be walking us through this today. Welcome, Laura.
Hey, everybody. Okay, so this is going to be for the CDBG CV reallocation towards Pisgah Legal Services and HelpMate. Key takeaways: in March of 2020, Congress approved a special allocation of the Community Development Block Grant to directly prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID-19. The city was awarded roughly $1,505,000 through the CDBG CV program, and it funded multiple activities intended to reduce the impact of the pandemic on the unhoused individuals as part of the fiscal year 1920 annual action plan. There is currently just under $100,000 of city CDBG CV funding that has not yet been obligated. HUD requires 80% of CDBG CV funds to be spent down by September of 2023. 2 eligible projects have been identified that can utilize the remaining CDBG CV funding to serve the target populations. These 2 were HelpMate and Pisgah Legal Services. Staff is seeking action from HCD to advance these projects as amendments to the fiscal year 1920 annual action plan. Next. Okay. So we're going to start with Pisgah Legal. So Pisgah Legal Services, beginning in August of 2020, they started administering their eviction prevention project, which provided financial support for rent, rental arrears, security deposits, utility arrears, and utility payments. Pisgah Legal Services was awarded roughly $199,000 from the round 1 allocation and about $955,000 from the round 3 allocation of the CDBG CV program, and this went towards the eviction prevention project. To date, all of the round 1 funds have been spent, and 83% of the round 3 funds have been spent. Pisgah Legal expects to spend the remaining balance of the CDBG CV funding by the end of April 2023. Pisgah Legal Services has been identified as eligible for additional CDBG CV funds in the amount of $20,000 from the city to continue funding the eviction prevention program. Next slide. Now we can start with HelpMate, their CDBG CV reimbursement. During the COVID-19 pandemic, rates of domestic violence increased substantially across the United States after jurisdictions imposed pandemic-related lockdown orders. Domestic violence rates in Asheville followed national trends. HelpMate reported that in fiscal year 2021, there was a 52% increase in the number of services rendered to survivors compared to the previous year. And in fiscal year 21-22, HelpMate reported a 21% increase in the number of services rendered to survivors than in fiscal year 2021. As a result of national trends, new eligibility guidance was released by HUD in 2022, allowing CDBG CV funds to be used to address the increased community violence resulting from the pandemic, and this includes domestic violence interventions. In February 2023, HelpMate was awarded $102,000 in CDBG CV funding that is a proven track record of effectively spending down funds once awarded. HelpMate has also been identified as eligible for receiving an additional $70,000 in CDBG CV funds to reimburse them for expenses incurred as a result of the heightened rates of domestic violence in the community during the pandemic. Next slide. So this is just like a general breakdown of the funding, and this is the round 1 funding. So if you look at the bottom, that's where the HelpMate emergency COVID shelter that previously went to HCD, I think last month. It's just waiting for council approval, but that also came from different past funding sources that were fully expended. And then you can also see here that Pisgah Legal has a proven track record of spending down these CDBG CV funds. Next slide. This is the round 3 funding, and this is where the reallocation for today is coming from. So the CDBG CV city administration costs, we set aside about $174,000 for that. To date, we've only spent $30,000 of that, so that's about 17% of those funds that have been spent down. The plan was to keep about $44,000 of that as just an emergency safety net in case we need it for ongoing CDBG CV administration costs. That leaves about $100,000 left over that need to be reallocated. So that's where that comes into play with Pisgah Legal and HelpMate. We're suggesting about $20,000 of that goes towards Pisgah Legal and $70,000 of that goes towards HelpMate. Next slide. Staff recommendations. The city has previously funded Pisgah Legal Services for the same project using CDBG CV funds to address the needs of individuals struggling to maintain housing as a result of COVID-19. Helpmate's $70,600 reimbursement request is aligned with HUD's CDBG CV community violence eligibility guidance. The funds available for reallocation to Pisgah Legal and Helpmate come from the remaining and completed round 3 CDBG CV city administration costs. This proposal would meet an unanticipated need, help the city spend CDBG CV funds on eligible activities, and help us stay in compliance with HUD's timeliness requirements. If both projects are approved, the reimbursement would bring the total CDBG CV funds spent to approximately $911,000, representing 62% of both round 1 and round 3 allocations. Next slide. Key takeaways. In March 2020, Congress approved a special allocation of the Community Development Block Grant to directly prevent, prepare for, and respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. The city was awarded roughly $1,505,000 through the CDBG CV program and funded multiple activities intended to reduce the impact of the pandemic on unhoused individuals as part of the fiscal year 1920 annual action plan. There is currently just under $100,000 of CDBG CV funding that has not yet been obligated. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development requires 80% of the CDBG CV funds be spent down by September 2023. 2 eligible projects have been identified, and those were Helpmate and Pisgah Legal. Staff is seeking action from HTD to advance these projects as amendments to the fiscal year 1920 annual action plan. Next slide. So the suggested motions today would be to recommend that City Council reallocate $20,000 of available Community Development Block Grant COVID CDBG CV funds to continue funding Pisgah Legal Services Eviction Prevention Program as an amendment to the fiscal year 1920 annual action plan. And the next motion was to recommend that City Council reallocate $70,600 of available Community Development Block Grant COVID CDBG CV funds to reimburse Helpmate for expenses incurred during COVID-19 as an amendment to the fiscal year 1920 annual action plan.
Woo, that's a lot of acronyms. CDBG,
Oh my God.
CDBG, CVC. You did a great job, Laura.
Say that 5 times fast.
It was great. I think this is the first time you've joined us on HCD, and you did a wonderful job. Thank you. That was a lot of CDBG, CV, but great. Okay, so and this looks great. I didn't realize that it was coming from the admins. That was a helpful explanation, and I'm glad you guys still have a little bit of a nest egg there, should it be needed. Any thoughts on why we only spent the 30? Is it started late or delays? And why didn't we end up using so much admin cost?
I think it was not a delay, but my previous position was CDBG CV admin, and that kind of ended early, and it kind of started late as well.
Great. Okay. Well, Councilwoman, any thoughts, questions, comments, concerns about these recommendations? They seem to make sense.
I'll just pipe in. I think the good news is that Laura is now a permanent part of our staff. So we bill her time to the regular CDBG, but yeah, so we're happy to have Laura.
Congrats on that, Laura.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, it looks like you're going to be successful in your first presentation to us because it seems like we're ready for a motion. It looks like we need 2.
All right, I'll make a motion to recommend City Council reallocate $20,000 of available Community Development Block Grant COVID CDBG CV funds to continue funding Pisgah Legal Services Eviction Prevention Project as an amendment to the fiscal year 19 and 20 annual action plan.
Second.
Great. We'll do a roll call vote. Councilwoman Smith?
Aye.
Councilwoman Mosley?
Aye.
Myself, aye. And I just want to say CDBG CV one more time. Okay. Why don't we have another motion? And would anyone like to make it?
I move to recommend that City Council reallocate $70,600 of available Community Block Grant COVID funds to reimburse Helpmate for expenses incurred during COVID-19 as an amendment to the FY 1920 annual action plan.
Second.
Great. We'll move to a roll call vote. Councilwoman Mosley?
Aye.
Councilwoman Smith?
Aye.
Myself, aye. Great. Then great. Congrats to Pisgah and Helpmate for the additional funding, and a big thank you to them for always working so hard in the community. I'm glad we were able to do that. Looking back at our agenda, I believe that is the last item on our agenda, except for number 5, which is public comment. Did we have any public comment or callers?
Checking right now. No, we do not.
Okay, this might be the simplest allocation meeting yet here at the end of March Housing Madness. Okay, thank you for your time today, everyone. We're going to finish a little bit early too, so maybe we can get out there and get in the sun a little bit. We are adjourned. And